The Destruction of Intelligence by Olavo de Carvalho. Learning, imitating, and internalizing the vocabulary, the mental and verbal mannerisms of the dominant school of thought in your university is, for a young student, an enormous challenge. It's also the ticket to enter the world of their intellectual superiors, the so admired professors. This process isn't merely intellectual. It's a psychological transformation, a rite of passage into adulthood. Through this transformation, the student sheds their last traces of childhood sentimentality and steps into the adult world of active social participation. The complexity of mastering this language, which demands the full engagement of one's memory, imagination, and performative ability, turns it into something far more than a simple intellectual conquest. It's easy to mistake the psychological absorption of this new persona for actual intellectual agreement. Before they even realize it, the novice is already reciting the discourse, convinced they are thinking independently and exercising their critical thinking. Sure, imitation is the foundation of all learning, but imitation works because you copy one thing, then another, and gradually accumulate a variety of tricks that finally form your own way of seeing, feeling, and expressing. For writers, this is blatantly obvious. The simple effort of absorbing the tone, rhythm, and style of a great writer when reading is already a mental imitation. That imitation becomes even more explicit when you memorize and recite poems, speeches, or chapters from a narrative. In your first attempts at writing, it's impossible not to adapt the linguistic turns you learned from great authors, whether Machado de Assis, Echa de Queiroz, Balzac, or others. If you're serious about writing, this process never really ends. When I met Herberto Salles, the author Otto Maria Carpo, regarded as the most artistically aware writer born in Brazil, he was sitting in the lobby of the Hotel Gloria with a volume of Proust and a notebook, jotting down every expressive solution the novelist found, to use when needed in his own way. He was well into his 70s at that point, still practicing the lessons of Antoine Albalat. In this way, through the accumulation and diversification of learned resources, your personal style emerges, forming alongside the natural evolution of your personality. T.S. Eliot used to say that a writer is only truly great when their work reflects the entire history of literary art as if it were woven into the fabric of their writing. Imitation is just as critical in other fields of learning. In martial arts, for instance, how many times must you repeat the movements of your instructor before performing them on your own? A musician learns countless masterpieces by heart before they create their own compositions. The same goes for complex sciences and technology. You don't just learn by reading manuals. You have to observe and imitate more experienced technicians. This subtle assimilation process often involves a large degree of nonverbal transmission. Why would it be any different in philosophy? Understanding a philosophy is never just about reading a philosopher's works and passing judgment on them based on immediate reactions or a professor's opinion. It means absorbing their way of seeing and thinking as if it were your own. You need to approach the world with the philosopher's eyes, with an open-mindedness that embraces even their potential mistake. If you start reading with a critical eye from the beginning, looking for errors and limitations, you're merely reducing the philosopher to the scale of your own impressions, rather than expanding yourself to encompass their universe. Errors and limitations shouldn't be sought out. They should arise naturally as you continue to assimilate new authors and ways of thinking, weighing each one against the broader philosophical tradition. It wouldn't be wrong to say that one of the main criteria for evaluating a philosophy professor is the number and variety of authors and schools of thought they expose their students to. The more perspectives they offer, the better the students can develop their own ideas. However, what happens when a student is subjected to years of monopolistic influence by a dominant school of thought, limited in its scope and interests, and trained to disregard everything else under the excuse that it's not a university reference? If 4, 5, or 6 years, you are forced to mimic the same ideas, with the fear that failing to adapt might end your academic career. Imitation stops being a temporary exercise and becomes a permanent mode of being, a habit in the Aristotelian sense. It's like an actor forced to play the same role, not only on stage but in real life, until they can no longer distinguish themselves from the character, much less play any other roles, including their own. Luigi Pirandello masterfully explored this absurd situation in his play Henry IV, where a mad millionaire, believing himself to be the king, compels his employees to act as court officials until they themselves start believing they really are. Every act of imitation requires an openness of the soul, an empathetic absorption where the other ceases to be the other and becomes a part of us. If we practice this with various models, unafraid of contradiction, our minds are enriched. We develop a universal perspective that frees us from the constraints of our immediate mental environment and makes us better judges of the knowledge we encounter. In contrast, rigidly locking the soul into a single role corrupts and extinguishes the ability to imitate at all, blocking any potential for empathy toward new ideas, styles, and perspectives. The student who grows accustomed to taking Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre, Foucault, Lacan, Derrida as their exclusive intellectual universe, looking at everything else with suspicion, ends up not only trapped in a provincialism that believes itself the center of the world, but also loses the capacity to learn. They become a mere regurgitator of cliches, prematurely senile. Anyone familiar with the Brazilian academic environment knows that, for over half a century, the default intellectual recipe has been Marx, Nietzsche, Sartre, Foucault, Lacan, Derrida, with the only additions being those that seem to extend this tradition, like Slavoj Žižek or Istvan Messeros. This intellectual closure is deliberately sought and imposed as an ideal. It's not that the current generation of professors consciously aim to stupefy their students. Rather, deluded by the notion that they've been the most enlightened segment of the population since the 1960s, they mistook themselves for models of all intellectual life. By forcing these models on their students, they believed they were creating a generation of geniuses. In reality, these professors, blinded by an illusion of intellectual grandeur, became endemic carriers of the Dunning-Kruger syndrome, which they passed on to the next generation. 50% of functionally illiterate students they produced are the exact image of their synthesis of incompetence and arrogance.